our Civil Liberties project by Maia, Andre, and Victoria, we'll be talking about freedom of speech. Civil liberties are a set of rule books on how the government should treat their citizens. Civil liberties are rights that are given to every citizen, and for our project, we'll be talking about freedom of speech, civil liberties.
Perhaps freedom of speech is talked about the most. Free speech is the cornerstone of our democracy. Although what you say can have consequences, like losing friends or a job, it gives Americans the right to express opinions without government censorship or control. And more importantly, you can't go to jail for expressing your opinion. It not only protects the speech that people like, but speech that people don't. Because when it comes to free speech, either everyone is protected or no one is at all. It allows citizens to support political movements and candidates. It gives people the power to call out government corruption and abuse. And most importantly, it empowers people to give unpopular opinions.
However, there are some exceptions to this free speech liberty. Some prefer the term responsibility. One of the main ones is in the workplace. A lot of private employers, like corporations, businesses, and kind of non-government, non-profit organizations can restrict some of your free speech. It's not protected in many of the private sectors. So this kind of includes, making inappropriate or discriminatory jokes to your coworker, threatening them, quid pro quo, and more. Another example of this exemption is defamation. So this is when someone speaks words or posts something on social media that harms the reputation of another person. So an example of this could be a customer accusing a restaurant of giving them food poisoning when they didn't actually get food poisoning. So this would not only affect the reputation of the restaurant, but also their business and how much money they're making. Some more examples of this include threats of violence, some forms of hate speech, and more.
Times the First Amendment has come into question in regards to the press, and this has come up to Supreme Court cases. We'll be talking about two of them. The first one is New York Times v. Sullivan and Hazelwood School District versus Coal Mine. Both are examples of press being protected by the First Amendment. And they show examples of speech being protected and where the First Amendment does not apply to the press. The first case we'll talk about is New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964. This dispute occurred when the New York Times released an article with controversial takes about a police commissioner. The police commissioner argued that these were false accusations that tarnished his reputation. This was a big civil rights case as it was closely tied to the work of Martin Luther King. The Supreme Court eventually sided with the New York Times, saying that they were protected by the First Amendment and freedom of press and free speech. They ruled that in further cases, the plaintiff must show evidence of clear recklessness to tarnish their reputation. The next case we'll talk about is Hazelwood School District versus Coal Mine. This dispute occurred when a public school newspaper tried to release articles with graphic content, one being about teen pregnancy and the other one being about divorce. The principal published the newspaper but without these graphic articles, and the students sued, claiming that their First Amendment right had been violated. The case eventually went up to the Supreme Court level many years later, and it came to the conclusion that because the school funded the article, they could censor the article, and that basically if you funded it, they could censor it. They also said that the copies the students made of the graphic articles that they released were protected by the First Amendment. This is still heavily debated and talked about today as comes up in the university level and others. That'll wrap up the Supreme Court cases.
So there has been a lot of legislation and executive orders relating to free speech. Free speech has been a popular topic among politicians. seemingly more around Republicans. Previous President Donald Trump voiced many concerns about quote-unquote, online censorship and liberal schools pushing agendas. And this was seen in one of his executive orders, which was number 13798, which was established in 2017. So the goal was to promote free speech, especially religious speech, and it quotes, "All executive departments and agencies shall, to the extent practicable and to the extent permitted by law, respect and protect the freedom of persons, organizations to engage in religious and political speech." There was some debate about this executive order as it didn't really outline any rules. It was kind of just restating the First Amendment. And recently a piece of legislation was introduced by Representative Francis Rooney of Florida. So the bill, HR 1672, would quote-unquote prohibit misleadingly labeled free speech zones on college campuses. So this was kind of more about college campus free speech and how there's some kind of debate about that. In Alabama, SB 152 was enacted, and it put restrictions on protesters, which is a big topic right now, such as their location, a limit on the number of protesters, and more. And it even allowed the state to charge protesters a fee, and some argued this goes against the First Amendment, which is why I included it in this slide. So we talked about legislation, we talked about executive orders, the Constitution, and Supreme Court, but how does the free speech affect us today? So there's some current events we can look at. For example, defamation cases. You must have heard Alex Jones in the Sandy Hook case, where Alex Jones, who's part of InfoWars, got sued for basically saying the Sandy Hook cases, or the Sandy Hook events were not real and didn't exist. I'm sure you've all heard about Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp, defamation against Cardi B. Then, of course, there's the protests recently, where in Georgia there was quote-unquote Cop City protests. You all know about the Cal Poly Humboldt housing protests, which is a form of free speech, and of course the Black Lives Matter protests. There's also been freedom of speech topics in the media and press. For example, Twitter, Trump, and Elon Musk, where Trump got kind of booted off for saying some things, and people are arguing that that goes against free speech. However, we know that that's a private company and they're allowed to do that. So there was that, and then of course the Instagram fake news button, many people claim that was censorship. We learned a lot about free speech today. I hope you enjoyed our presentation, and thank you. And here is our works cited.